On July 4, 1976, Americans threw a party in the wreckage of a constitutional crisis they just barely survived. Nixon had quit less than 2 years earlier, chased out not by tanks or a coup, but by the plain, grinding machinery of the Republic doing its job, a special prosecutor, a unanimous Supreme Court, congressmen willing to vote against their own president. The tall ships came into New York Harbor that summer with Vietnam and stagflation, and a decade of scandal still hanging in the air, and yet the mood was something close to relief. The system got tested. The system held. That was the story the country told itself turning 200. At 250, that story is a lot harder to tell. The disillusionment feels familiar. A decade of MAGA and the backlash to it has left people across the spectrum feeling like the country they thought they knew has quietly disappeared. But this time the institutions themselves are the problem, not just the backdrop. In 1974, Congress still acted like a jealous, independent branch, one that could actually discipline a president. In 2026, Congress barely functions as a rival to the White House at all. It's either a rubber stamp when the president's party runs it, or a room full of angry press conferences when the opposition does, with almost no power to actually make anyone do anything. The Supreme Court still has teeth, but it's mostly been handing the presidency more room to maneuver, not less. The 70s crisis happened inside institutions that worked. This one is happening to the institutions themselves. And that's exactly why the oldest, corniest comparison in American political life, ancient Rome, suddenly stops sounding like a rhetorical flourish and starts sounding like a diagnosis. It's not an accident that Americans reach for Rome. It's baked into the country's DNA. The founders wrote under fake Roman names. Publius, Brutus, Cato built a Senate, gave the executive a veto, read their Polybius and their Plutarch like homework. And they weren't inspired by Rome's greatness so much as terrified by its collapse. Practically the whole architecture of the Constitution, separated powers, staggered terms, and independent judiciary, is a set of patches against the specific failure modes they'd identified in Rome's fall: power pooling in one man's hands, public office turning into private property, factions choosing to burn the shared house down rather than lose a fight inside it. So when people today ask, where are we on the Rome timeline, they're asking a question the founders would have taken completely seriously. And the honest answer isn't the part everybody already knows: Caesar at the Rubicon, Antony and Cleopatra going down in flames at Actium. It's an earlier, messier, less cinematic moment, the era of a man named Sulla in the 80s and 70s BC. Sulla is the guy history forgot, which is exactly why he matters more than Caesar for understanding how republics actually die. In 88 BC he was consul, Rome's top elected job, and his political rivals stripped him of a military command he felt was rightfully his. So he did something no Roman had done in over 400 years of the Republic. He turned his own legions around and marched them on Rome. Every officer under him but one refused to go along. That's how sacred the taboo was. The soldiers marched anyway, because somewhere along the way their loyalty had quietly shifted from the state to the man who paid them and promised them land. Sulla took the city, killed or exiled his enemies, and had himself made dictator through paperwork that was technically legal and completely obscene in practice. He used the job to run prescriptions, literal kill lists nailed up in public, complete with property seizures for whoever turned the names in. And then, having rewritten the Constitution specifically to stop the next guy from doing what he'd just done, he retired to the countryside and died peacefully in his bed. Here's the part that actually matters for America. Sulla genuinely believed he was saving the Republic. His reforms were designed to make his own coup impossible to repeat. They failed instantly, not because the laws were badly written, but because laws were never the thing holding ambitious men back in the first place. What held them back was the maiorum, the unwritten code, the shared sense that some things simply weren't done. Sulla proved they could be done, and that you could do them and still die comfortable and rich. Every ambitious Roman who came up after him, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, absorbed the lesson like mother's milk. Caesar reportedly said Sulla's retirement proved the man didn't understand politics. Once the taboo broke, it stayed broken. Nobody could unbreak it. What's eerie about the 30 years between Sulla's death and Caesar crossing the Rubicon is that the whole time, Rome looked completely fine. Elections happened on schedule. The Senate met, debated, passed laws. Courts heard cases. A Roman pulled forward 100 years would have recognized every institution. He just wouldn't have recognized how any of them actually worked anymore. The Senate still voted, but its votes increasingly just rubber-stamped decisions already made by whoever controlled the money and the armies. When Pompey wanted an extraordinary command in 67 BC, and the Senate said no, he simply went around them through a popular vote. When the Senate wouldn't cooperate with the unofficial alliance between Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, the three of them just carved up the state's top offices between themselves like splitting a business. Senators who couldn't be bought were intimidated, and the ones who couldn't be intimidated got prosecuted. Courts became weapons. A rising politician announced himself by indicting an enemy, and juries were stacked depending on whose faction had won the last round. Political violence followed the exact same curve. It started at the edges. The Gracchi brothers, reformist tribunes, murdered by senatorial mobs in 133 and 121 BC, events so shocking their contemporaries treated them as freak occurrences. 2 generations later, organized street gangs were a routine part of campaign season. Elections got postponed because the streets weren't safe to walk, and every escalation was justified as retaliation for the last one. Each side sincerely believed it was the one defending the Republic. And every round left the unwritten rules a little thinner, until the only rule left standing was the one Sulla had already answered back in 88 BC, whoever has the soldiers wins. Map that honestly onto America in 2026, and some of it lines up uncomfortably well, and some of it doesn't line up at all. Both parts are worth taking seriously. Congress is the strongest parallel, and it didn't start with Trump. It's a decades-long slide the last 10 years just stepped on the gas for. War powers, tariff powers, spending powers, oversight. Congress has handed almost all of it to the executive branch, piece by piece, because individual members discovered that loyalty to a national movement pays better career-wise than defending their own institution's turf. Madison's whole theory was that ambition would check ambition. It failed exactly the way Rome's mixed constitution failed. Ambition detached from the institution and reattached itself to the faction and the leader instead. The courts are a softer version of the same story. The Supreme Court in 2026 isn't a bought Roman jury. It rules against the White House plenty. But its biggest recent moves, broad presidential immunity, wide deference on emergency powers, have mostly expanded the space a president can operate in without real consequence, on the theory that elections and impeachment are the proper remedy. Rome's Senate believed something similar right up until the remedies stopped being real. When actually removing a president requires a 2/3 Senate vote that partisanship makes basically impossible, immunity plus impeachment isn't accountability, it's just a fancy description of no accountability at all. The politicized prosecution parallel lines up almost too well. In a single decade, Americans watched a former president criminally charged by his successor's Justice Department, and then watched that same man, back in office, turn around and aim investigations at his own enemies, with each side experiencing its own moves as justice and the others as persecution. A Roman from the 60s BC would recognize this instantly, including the ugliest part. Once prosecution becomes a weapon, leaving office gets dangerous, and leaders who fear prosecution have a very rational reason never to give up power. That exact fear, that his enemies would prosecute him the second he put down his command, is widely considered one of the reasons Caesar crossed the river at all. And underneath all of it is the erosion of norms, the maiorum problem, which is really the whole ballgame. January 6th is about as close as America has come to its own sullen moment, not because it worked, but because of what happened after. The initial shock, bipartisan and genuine, curdled within a few years into minimization, reinterpretation, mass pardons. The lesson the political class absorbed wasn't never again. It was, this is survivable, maybe even rewarded. That's precisely the lesson Rome's elite took from Sulla, and it spreads not through the original rule breaker, but through the next generation watching the rule breaking go unpunished. Now for where the analogy falls apart, because it does, in some important places, and pretending otherwise turns this into lazy doom-mongering instead of an honest comparison. The biggest one is the armies. Rome's republic died for one structural reason above all others. Its soldiers were loyal to their generals, who recruited them, paid them, promised them land instead of to the state. Every other problem was survivable. That one wasn't. America has nothing like it. The U.S. military remains institutionally loyal to the Constitution and famously allergic to domestic political fights, and its senior leadership keeps saying so out loud. Domestic troop deployments and fights over the National Guard have tested the edges of that norm, and nobody should assume it's permanently bulletproof. But there's no American legion personally loyal to one man, and until there is, Rome's actual endgame, private armies fighting a civil war, isn't on the table. Second, elections still change who's in charge. Rome's late elections picked magistrates who operated inside a power structure the votes couldn't touch. The real decisions were made by the dynasts regardless. American elections, whatever their problems with money and gerrymandering, still determine who actually runs the government, as the ugly but real transfers of 2020 and 2024 both showed. A system where the ruling faction can genuinely lose is just a different animal than one where it can't. Third, federalism. Rome was a city-state that swallowed an empire, one single point of failure. America spreads real power across 50 states with their own constitutions, courts, and police. That's not a guarantee against a national breakdown. 1861 proved that, but it does mean losing Washington isn't the same as losing the country, and Rome never had that kind of redundancy. Fourth, the clock. From Sulla's march to Actium was 57 years, 2 generations, 3 civil wars. Decline isn't a train running on a schedule, and Rome had plenty of stretches, the 70s BC, the settlements of the 50s, when people reasonably thought the worst had passed. Anyone dating America's decline to 2016 is describing one decade. The country pulled out of the 1850s and 60s, the 1930s, the late 60s and 70s, each of which produced its own confident predictions that this was finally the end. So what does the late Republic actually teach, if it's not just a countdown clock? It teaches that constitutions run on norms, not paper. Sulla's laws got repealed within a decade, his precedent never did. No legal text can save a political class that's already stopped believing the system is legitimate, because every rule only works if the people running it choose daily to honor its spirit. It teaches that cynicism is jet fuel. Rome's final generation wasn't full of people who loved tyranny, it was full of people convinced the Republic was already a sham, that the other side had already killed it, so playing fair was for suckers. Once enough people believe the institutions are already dead, acting like they're alive starts to look naive, and the belief makes itself true. It teaches that the ending gets invited, not imposed. Augustus didn't conquer an unwilling Rome, he offered an exhausted one a deal. Safety and stability in exchange for the substance of the Republic, keeping just the shell of it standing. And Rome took the deal gratefully. Nobody overthrew the institutions. People just stopped believing they could deliver the basics, and once that belief was gone, a strongman wasn't imposed on them so much as requested. And finally, it teaches that the clock isn't fixed. Rome in 70 BC still had choices. Collapse only looks inevitable looking backward. The people actually living it experienced near misses, forks in the road, moments where one different decision by one identifiable person would have changed everything. Which is where this honestly lands. America at 250 isn't Rome in 49 BC, with Caesar already at the river. It's closer to Rome right after Sulla, a republic with its forms intact and its norms badly bruised, a political class that's learned the unthinkable is survivable, factions that each believe the other side already broke the deal, but an army that still obeys the state, elections that still actually transfer power, and a future still being written by people who haven't yet made the irreversible choice. 50 years ago, the country celebrated passing a test. The question at 250 is harder, not whether the system held, but whether the generation that just watched its taboos get broken decides the Republic is still worth the boring, daily work of believing in. Rome's generation decided it wasn't. Nothing says this one has to make the same call.